A new horizon. If you press a group of school children to explain why we're teetering on the edge of calamity, they'll soon trot out all the coffeehouse cliches, all the theories the Unabomber set forth so solemnly and at such great length in his magnum opus a couple years ago. Out of control technological advancement, out of control industrial greed, out of control government expansion, and so on. How do you think all these commonplace explanations evolved? I have no idea, I said. Forgive me for answering so promptly, but I know this is something I've never given any thought to. Then let's give it some thought now. One of the major obstacles to building the Panama Canal in the late decades of the 19th century was yellow fever. Its cause was unknown and it was untreatable by the medical science of the day. Perhaps you know something of this. Yes. At that time, it was thought to be caused by night air. People who stayed inside at night caught the disease less often than those who went out. But some who stayed inside at night caught it anyways. That's right, because they left their windows open. Eventually, people realized that they had to be very careful not to let in any night air at all. But, as Walter Reed eventually discovered, the carrier of the disease wasn't the night air. It was the Aedes aegypti, mosquito, which hunts in the night air. Yes. What led people to think that night air was to blame? I shook my head, boggled by the question, and told B I didn't know how to answer it. Make a start at it all the same, he said. Give it a shot. I shrugged and gave it a shot. This is what people thought. There wasn't anything inherently irrational in the idea, and in fact it had some merit. Good. I should add that the account you've just given is more legend than fact, but it serves to illustrate the point. The ideas the Unabomber articulated are also what people think. There isn't anything inherently irrational in them, and in fact they have some merit. Okay, I see what you're saying, vaguely. Both groups are struggling under a handicap. Do you see what it is? I'd say that in both groups their intellectual horizon is too close. They're looking for causes too near to the effect. Exactly. This is the overriding effect of the Great Forgetting. In our culture, East and West, twins of a single birth, human history is only what's happened since our agricultural revolution began. In our culture, because of the Great Forgetting, people looking at the horizon are only looking back in time a few thousand years. In 1654, Archbishop Usher calculated that the human race was born in 4004 BC. Later, archaeologists calculate that this is just when the very first cities of Mesopotamia began to be built. For a people who imagined that man was born an agriculturalist and a civilization builder, what could make better sense? The human race appeared in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago and immediately began building cities. The Great Forgetting imprinted this picture indelibly on our cultural mind. It doesn't matter that everyone knows the human race is 3 million years older than the cities of Mesopotamia. Every molecule of thought in our culture bears the impress of the idea that we needn't look beyond the Mesopotamian horizon in order to understand our history. And you're telling me that your horizon is 3 million years? Always. For me, Mesopotamia is erased as a horizon. How do you think one manages such a thing? I suppose one manages it by climbing a ladder, which is to say by seeing things from a higher vantage point. That's right. When you do that, events that formerly seemed huge, because they're close, take their place in a deeper landscape and no longer stand out with the same prominence as before. Climbing the ladder. We were talking about the cliches that people trot out to explain why we're teetering on the edge of calamity. Out of control technological advancement, out of control industrial greed, out of control government expansion, and so on. These are explanations that make sense to people of the Great Forgetting, to people who think that they're seeing the human horizon when they look at the Mesopotamian horizon. For people of the Great Forgetting, our agricultural revolution was literally the beginning of human history. When I view the human horizon, I'm looking back 3 million years past the Mesopotamian horizon, so it's simply grotesque to think of our agricultural revolution as signaling the beginning of human history. It signals something, to be sure, but not remotely the beginning of human history. Feeling it was time to manifest some evidence of consciousness, I said, "What does it signal, then?" "It signals the occurrence of a mind change, a new vision of the world, and our place in it." "How do you conclude that a mind change occurred?" I conclude it from the fact that a revolution occurred, B replied. Revolutions don't occur among people who are thinking in the same old way. Can't changed social or economic conditions produce a revolution? Surely you don't mean that. People produce revolutions, not conditions. I mean, can't people react in a revolutionary way to changed social or economic conditions? Of course they can, but the question is, can they react in a revolutionary way without first thinking in a revolutionary way? I had to admit that I couldn't imagine revolutionary action taking place in the absence of revolutionary thinking. B said, I've heard naive thinkers suggest that our agricultural revolution came about as a response to famine. Why is that naive? It's naive because starving people don't plant crops any more than drowning people build life rafts. The only people who can afford to wait for crops to grow are people who already have food. Yes, that makes sense. You will also hear it conjectured that agriculture was pretty much an inevitable development because it makes life so much easier and much more secure. In fact, it makes life more toilsome and less secure. Every study of calories spent versus calories gained confirms that the more your food comes from agriculture, the harder you have to work for it. The first Neolithic farmers, who probably only planted a few crops and depended largely on foraging, worked much harder to stay alive than their Mesolithic ancestors. Later, farmers planted more crops and did less foraging, worked even harder to stay alive, and completely modern totalitarian farmers, who depend entirely on crops, work harder to stay alive than anyone else. And famine, far from being banished by agriculture, is actually a byproduct of agriculture and is never found apart from it. Travel to the most inhospitable desert of Australia during the most horrendous drought, and you won't find a single starving Aborigine anywhere. Okay, I said, I guess I see what you're doing. You're answering all the objections before they're raised. All the objections to what? To your thesis. Which is what? Which is that our agricultural revolution signaled the appearance of a mind change. It wasn't just starving people trying something new out of desperation. It wasn't just people looking for an easier life. It wasn't just people looking for more security. That's right. Far from having an easier life or increasing their security, they actually worked harder and were less secure than their hunting-gathering ancestors. So there's no question here of people doing something just because it was more comfortable. It seemed to me that B was in danger of defeating himself with his own arguments. I said, to hear you tell it, our agricultural revolution had so little going for it that it's a wonder it happened at all. It truly is a wonder that it happened, B said emphatically. That's precisely what I want you to see, and when you see it, your vision of human history will be changed forever. The peace-loving killers of New Guinea. I find at this point that I need a mosaic piece with a particular feature that will be supplied by the Gabusi of New Guinea. Okay, I said. It's become popular in recent decades to speak of demonizing people who are especially feared or hated, turning them into monsters of depravity. I've never actually heard the opposite tendency mentioned, but of course it's equally possible to angelize people who are especially admired or revered, to turn them into perfect beings who embodied all desired qualities. For example, there's been a recent tendency for people to angelize lever peoples, wherever they're to be found, to imagine them as infinitely wise, selfless, far-seeing environmentalist saints who practice perfect gender equality and never speak in contractions. Do you know what I'm talking about? Certainly. I don't live in a refrigerator. I've seen Dances with Wolves. Good, B said. Since angels are more or less all the same, the process of angelizing these peoples, call them levers or aborigines, it doesn't matter, which tends to make them all out to be more or less the same as well, which is as far from the truth as you can possibly get. This is where the Gabusi of New Guinea come in. I'd like to take a few minutes to describe them to you. Okay. The Gabusi are one of those agricultural peoples whose agricultural style owes nothing to our revolution. In fact, it would make better sense to call them hunter-gardeners than farmers. They're villagers who love to socialize, celebrate, and party with a lot of shouting, singing, and joking. 2/3 of them die of what we would call natural causes, and 1/3 are murdered by friends, neighbors, or relatives. Murder is male business, and at any given time, 2/3 of the men have murdered someone. Nice folks to know, I put in. Oddly enough, they are, on the whole, very nice folks to know. Not saints, obviously, but pleasant, well-meaning people. If you were to ask them why they are so inclined towards violence, they literally would not know what you're talking about. They aren't notably inclined toward violence, and if you wanted to interview them about crime in their society, you'd have to begin by explaining what crime is. They do things that annoy each other, of course, and there are just as many greedy, boorish, inconsiderate, and selfish people among them as there are among us. But crime, as we understand it, is non-existent. Apart from homicide statistics, the main difference between them and us is their theory of sickness and death. We believe that sickness occurs when invisible creatures called microbes or germs or viruses invade our body. This theory seems nothing but blandly factual to us. But to thinkers of the 23rd century, should there happen to be any, it will probably seem as quaintly fanciful as the humoral theory of the Renaissance seems to us today. Do you find that imaginable? That our present theory of sickness will someday seem quaint? Oh yes, I find that entirely imaginable. Good. In the Gabusi theory, there's nothing that corresponds to our notion of death from natural causes. All causes of sickness and death are supernatural, and every sickness and death is caused by someone who literally wishes you ill. This may be a sorcerer, or it may be the spirit of someone living or dead, or even the spirit of an animal. To achieve a diagnosis in the case of illness, a medium visits the spirit world in order to discover the guilty party, and this information indicates the best means of treatment. If someone dies, the medium conducts an inquest in consultation with the spirits. Not every inquest leads to the accusation of a living person, but when it does, the accused sorcerer is given the chance to demonstrate his or her innocence by performing a sago divination, a cooking feat so difficult that skill alone can't assure success. You might compare its difficulty to cooking a perfect souffle the size of a bathtub. Complete success is taken as a sign that the spirit of the deceased was on hand to help out and thus exonerate the accused. Partial success leaves the matter in doubt, and the accused will be spared for a while, as other indicators are considered, such as the behavior of the corpse and the suspects present. As the result of the sago divination falls farther and farther short of success, guilt becomes clearer and clearer. In this event, since denial of the crime is pointless in the face of such evidence, the sorcerer will generally express remorse and try to persuade everyone that the anger that moved him or her to practice this sorcery has spent itself. Everyone wants to believe it and reassures the sorcerer that all is forgiven, but chances are the miscreant's days are numbered. Among the Gabusi, the spirits of the dead soon return as animals. Those who die young return as small animals, birds or lizards. Those who die at a more advanced age return as larger animals, cassowaries or crocodiles, for example. But executed sorcerers invariably return as wild pigs, which is why, I suspect, executed sorcerers are invariably cooked and eaten. My guess is that being sorcerers, they are already in some sense wild pigs, which are hunted not only because they're good to eat, but because they're inhabited by malevolent spirits. I interrupted to ask if the Gabusi practice cannibalism in other circumstances. As far as I know, B said, the only human item on their menu is roasted sorcerer. Fascinating. Now, to the point of this anthropological exercise. I want you to imagine that it was not the people of our culture who reamed over the world and made it their own, but rather the Gabusi. I want you to imagine a world where every death is routinely avenged by killing and eating a sorcerer. I want you to imagine a world where if you were a telephone installer, legislator, symphony conductor, or fashion designer in Berlin or Beijing or Tokyo or London or New York City, or Box Elder, Montana, you might at any moment be required to perform a successful sago divination in order to save your life. I want you to imagine a world where eating sorcerers is a perfectly normal thing to do, as normal as sending your children off to educational concentration camps when they reach the age of 5 or 6. I want you to imagine a world where killing a man will turn him into a wild pig as surely as punishing a man will turn him into a good citizen. B paused at this point and gave me a hopeful look that I wasn't sure how to answer. I said, I think you're telling me that every culture's lunacy seems like sanity to the members of that culture. That's certainly so, B said. If I were to tell you that the Gabusi believe that the creator of the universe has spoken to only one people on this earth during its entire history, and that one people is the Gabusi, you would smile patronizingly, wouldn't you? Yes, I suppose I would. Yet this is precisely what the people of our culture believe, isn't it? Has the creator of the universe spoken to anyone but us? No. Modern humans have been around for 200,000 years, but according to our beliefs, God had not had a word to say to any of them until we came along. God didn't speak to the Alawa of Australia, or to the Gabusi of New Guinea, or to the Bushmen of Africa, or to the Navajo of North America, or to the Ilhalimat of the Great Barrens of Canada. God didn't speak a word to any of the other hundreds of thousands of people of the world. He spoke only to us. Only to us did he reveal the order and purpose of creation. Only to us did he reveal the laws essential to salvation. That's right. Speaking with the voice of undoubted faith, that's right. But this isn't lunacy? No. Again, speaking with the voice of undoubted faith, this isn't lunacy. It would be completely silly for the Gabusi to believe that they are in direct, exclusive contact with the creator of the universe. But it's perfectly reasonable for us to believe it? That's right. Evidently, it isn't just the history of the world that the victors get to write, it's the theology of the world as well. Yes, that's so. All the same, right now, I'm not asking you to understand something. I'm asking you to do something. What do you want me to do? I want you to imagine that the world, this world right here, is a Gabusi world. You, as a Roman Catholic priest, would be tolerated as a vestige of a quaint and harmless superstition. At night, men would cluster in bars, not to watch televised sports, but to hold raunchy conversations with female spirits clinging to the rafters. Spirit mediums would be on hand to diagnose and cure minor illnesses, and to conduct inquests into community deaths. Friends would invite you to a restaurant to celebrate a killing and send you home with a slice of roast sorcerer for your family. What more can I tell you? The films would be Gabusi films, the novels Gabusi novels, the politics Gabusi politics, the sports Gabusi sports, the fun Gabusi fun. I told him I could imagine it, more or less, but I can't imagine what you want me to say. How does it seem to you? How does it seem? It seems insane, obscene. Of course it does. Confined to their own few hundred square miles, the Gabusi are quaint and bizarre. Blow them up into a universal world culture to which every human must belong, and they become an obscenity. The same is true in general. Any culture will become an obscenity when blown up into a universal world culture to which all must belong. Confined to the few hundred square miles in which it was born, our own culture would have been merely quaint and bizarre. Blown up into a universal world culture to which all must belong, it is a horrifying obscenity. I think I'm beginning to see, I told him. I think I'm beginning to see what you're getting at as a whole. B nodded. You probably don't remember why I brought up the Gabusi in the first place. You said it was a wonder that we ever adopted totalitarian agriculture, considering the fact that, far from making life easier or more secure, it actually has the opposite effect. Yes, I remember. I wanted you to see that lifestyle strategies adopted in a culture aren't necessarily logical. They don't necessarily benefit people in obvious ways. They aren't necessarily adopted because they make life more comfortable. Though people may use this rationale to explain them to children and outsiders, in our culture, for example, the adoption of our style of agriculture is presented to our children as an inevitable step forward for the human race, because it makes life easier and more secure. I asked B what it did do if it doesn't make life easier and more secure. That's exactly what we're trying to understand here. We're presented with a complex of behaviors and we're trying to figure out how they work together to produce the result that we see. Right now, sort through the peculiarities of the Gabusi and see if you can find a mechanism that would tend to make them blow up into a universal world culture to which all must belong. I asked him what sort of mechanism he meant. Some dynamic within the culture, some custom, some deeply held belief. I spent a minute or two on it, but could find no mechanism that would produce that effect. Invent one, then, B said. I suppose territorial ambitions would have that effect. Not by themselves, B said. The Aztecs had territorial ambitions, but once they conquered you, they didn't give a damn how you lived. They weren't interested in turning their neighbors into Aztecs. This is why, vile as they may have been, they were not us, not what Ishmael calls takers. Okay, I see where you're coming from. You'd have to make them cultural missionaries if you wanted them to blow up into a whole world dominating culture. And in order to make them cultural missionaries, you'd have to endow them with a belief. Missionaries are nothing if not believers. What kind of believers would the Gabusi have to be? They'd have to be believers in the rightness of their way of life. Exactly. If the Gabusi believed that theirs was the one right way for all humans to live, which they don't, by the way, this would motivate them to become cultural missionaries to the world. But the belief alone wouldn't be enough. The people of our culture have always held this belief, have throughout history demonstrated that they held this belief, but they needed another mechanism as well. I suppose you could call it a spreading mechanism. A mechanism that would push them across the face of the earth as they spread the gospel of their cultural enlightenment. Agriculture, I said. Agriculture of a particular design, Jared, because not every kind of agriculture will push a people across the face of the earth. The modest agriculture of the Gabusi simply wouldn't support such an expansion. I understand. In our cultures, to support one peculiarity, we need a second peculiarity, and the two reinforced each other. We believed, and still believe, that we have the one right way for people to live. But we needed totalitarian agriculture to support our missionary effort. Totalitarian agriculture gave us fabulous food surpluses, which are the foundation of every military and economic expansion. No one was able to stand against us anywhere in the world because no one had a food-producing machine as powerful as ours. Our military and economic success confirmed our belief that we have the one right way for people to live. It still does so today. For the people of our culture, the fact that we're able to defeat and destroy any other lifestyle is taken as clear proof of our cultural superiority. Yes, I'm afraid that's so. When it comes to cultural survival of the fittest, we are the champs. You mean that we're champion exemplars of the process of natural selection? Well, yes, I guess that's what it means. B shook his head. It shouldn't be looked at that way. Evolutionary ideas always make risky metaphors. The tendency of biological evolution is towards diversity, is now, and always has been. Evolution isn't tending towards the one right species. From the beginning, it has always been tending away from the singularity from which all life sprang in the primordial stew. I remember as a boy reading a science fiction story about a mutant organism that was born in a drain. In the fortuitous confluence of a dib of this and a dab of that, this organism was driven by a single tropism, which is to turn living matter into itself. Unstopped, it had the capability of reversing, in a few days, billions of years of biological evolution by devouring all life forms on this planet and turning them into a single form, itself. This mutant organism is a perfect metaphor for our culture, which in just a few centuries is reversing millions of years of human development by devouring all cultures on this planet and turning them into a single culture, our own. An ugly thought, I said. It's an ugly process. Gunpowder, B said, is a mixture of potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur. And I suppose that if any one of these ingredients is missing, then the mixture is an explosive. Of course. As an explosive mixture, our culture also consists of 3 essential ingredients, and if any one of them had been missing, no explosion would have taken place here on this planet. We've already identified 2 of the ingredients, totalitarian agriculture and the belief that ours is the one right way. The third, of course, is the great forgetting. I thought about it some, but finally told him I couldn't see how the great forgetting had contributed to the explosion. It contributed to the explosion roughly the way that charcoal contributes to the explosion of gunpowder. How did we come to have the strange idea that our way is the one right way? I don't know. Let's go back again to the foundation thinkers of our culture. Herodotus, Confucius, Abraham, Anaximander, Pythagoras, Socrates, and any others you can think of. Assemble them all in one room and ask them this question. How long have people been living in the way we live? What would be their answer? Their answer would be people have been living this way from the beginning. In other words, man was born living this way. That's right. And what does this tell you about the nature of man? It tells me that man was meant to live this way. Man is meant to live as a totalitarian agriculturalist and a city builder, the way bees were meant to live as honey collectors and hive builders. So tell me, Jared, what else could this be except the one right way? Yes, I see that. What was missing from the education of these thinkers? What was forgotten during the Great Forgetting? What was forgotten was the fact that man was not born a totalitarian agriculturalist and a city builder. What was forgotten was the fact that our way was not ordained from the beginning of time. If this hadn't been forgotten, then we would never have been able to persuade ourselves that ours is the right way. This is why the Great Forgetting was an ingredient essential to our cultural explosion. Let's go for a walk, B said. There's something I have to pick up for you. Something for me? Something you'll need later. I started to head out the way I'd come, but B beckoned me in the opposite direction, down a hall that opened up behind his chair. The same hall from which Monica and Heinz Tito had appeared with refreshments the night before. The hall soon widened to accommodate concrete benches on either side, and B told me that it had been designed to serve as a bomb shelter for both the theater and a government office building the next street over. But I don't believe it was ever needed for that purpose, he added. After a couple 100 meters, the tunnel angled up and terminated at a heavy fire door that opened into the sub-basement storage room of a government building of some kind. Surprisingly to me, there was a desk here, and someone manning it, evidently to monitor access to the storage areas. This person, a middle-aged soldierly type who looked like he would have felt more comfortable in any sort of a uniform, glared at us with disapproval but made no vocal objection to our passing through his territory. 2 flights of stairs took us up the ground and out to the street.